Heroes of the Cross, Series 8. It says online that the author died in 1944. Dr. Apricot of Heaven Below, The Missionary Who Could Keep Smiling, David Duncan, Maine. Among the boys who played about the Scottish village of Dalrymple in Ayrshire between 60 and 70 years ago was one whose happy disposition, merry ways, and love of fun and mischief singled him out from his companions. Overflowing with vitality and energy, he soon became a leader among the boys of his own age. While they followed him in the tricks in which he delighted, they also caught something of his spirit, in which playfulness and helpfulness were so happily blended. His bright and buoyant spirit had an infectious influence. This boy gave a striking example of the truth of the proverb, "A merry heart doeth good like medicine." Now, aren't the Proverbs 31 chapters, and people like to say one for each day of the month? And what was true of his boyhood has been equally true of his manhood, in a still more conspicuous degree, and in wider circles than he had ever been imagined in his youth. For the boy became a medical missionary, and the name of Dr. D. Duncan, Maine of Hangzhou came to be a household word. For well nigh half a century, Dr. Maine carried on a great work in China, healing the bodies and caring for the souls of his people, winning them for Christ, and wherever he went, cheering countless numbers by his long life adherence to his own favorite motto, "Keep smiling." He has been a shining example of how a bright and happy disposition and a love of laughter can be combined with passionate loyalty to Christ and self-sacrificing service in his cause. Through many eventful days and years, with their alternating cloud and sunshine, he was able to keep smiling himself and to convey to others the contagion of his own radiant faith. The story of his life is a wonderful record of consecrated endeavor. It provides a modern demonstration of the fact that the days of romance in the mission field are with us still, and that in the work of carrying the gospel to the heathen, heathen literally means that the people have working areas that they share, or it means, the patch work homes and fireplaces and that sort of stuff. There is an unexampled opportunity for pioneering spirits to satisfy all their love of adventure and find the highest fulfillment of hopes even beyond the wildest dreams of their youth. Chinese carpenter making barrels, Yunnan Fu. So that relates more to the last story, right? David Duncan, Maine, was born on June 10th, 1856, era vulgaris, in Kirkmichael, Ayrshire, but his family removed to the neighboring village of Dalrymple, where his boyhood and youth were spent. It was a beautiful district, rich in historical associations, and the children enjoyed all the delights of a life in the country, so different in its environment and outlook from the congested and often squalid conditions of the large cities. But it was by no means a dull existence. There were all the local country games handed down from one generation to another, and the children, with an inventiveness of their own, were ever discovering fresh outlets for their abounding vitality and energy. In every new exploit, David Maine was a leader. Even then, he had a certain measure of resourcefulness, which became so prominent a characteristic in his latter career. He was full of jokes and tricks, but they were never ill-tempered. His heart was as kind as it was merry, and his good nature made friends for him everywhere. Dr. Apricot and a peasant, Chinese students at work. One incident in these days has been often recalled. It was a Saturday, and as the children passed one of the village churches, they saw that the doors were open for the weekly cleaning and airing. With the natural curiosity of childhood, they entered on tiptoe to see what was to be seen, and found no one in the building. It was David who mounted the pulpit stairs, and entering the pulpit, proceeded to deliver his first sermon. He exhorted his little companions to be good and do good, thus giving, although perhaps all unconsciously, what was to be the keynote of his own afterlife. Well, life after that point, but people tickle afterlife. But the frolics of these days were not allowed to interfere with his education. He was as keen in the school as in the playground. His lessons interested him, and he worked hard at them, with the result that in his 15th year he became a pupil teacher, and at the age of 16 left the school as head boy and medalist of his year. It was customary for boys who felt the spur of ambition for success in life to gravitate from the country to the city, and David, full of the desire to get on, secured an appointment with a shipping firm in Glasgow. This was in 1872, and he entered on a 5 years office engagement with characteristic enthusiasm and energy. He threw himself into his duties, and he had every prospect of advancement in the service. Then something occurred which changed the whole current of his life. Before he left the country, he had become a teacher in the Sunday school, and he kept up his church connection in Glasgow and fulfilled all the outward rites of religion. But a fellow clerk brought him to a crisis when he asked him one day, "David, are you a Christian?" This had never been put so pointedly to him before, and he was rather at a loss for an answer. Going to a church doesn't make you a Christian, right? But then again, people come up with definitions other than, well, do you ever worship Jesus? Well, he replied hesitatingly, "I think I am. I read my Bible, go to church, and teach in the Sunday school. Yes, I think I am a Christian." "That's all right so far, David," said his companion, "but have you been born again?" This was new to him, and he had to confess that he did not know what being born again meant. People could have already been and not. So his friend took his Bible and pointed out text after text, expounding unto him the scriptures until he became very uncomfortable. A troubled night followed, and next day he had further conversation with his friend, who earnestly sought to make the way plain. But it was not until the evening, when on his knees in prayer, that it pleased the Lord to reveal himself in a sudden and most remarkable way, so that he was changed in a moment from being a good living, nominal believer in Jesus to being a true follower of him. Well, wasn't that the point, that he was a follower? So basically, you feel uncomfortable until you feel comfortable, and then you're born again. That night, April 14th, 1873, proved the date of his new birth, and for him the beginning of days destined to lead him out into worldwide service. It was only in keeping with his nature that he should at once throw all his ardor into the service of the Master, of whom he had received such a revelation, and to whom he had so joyously dedicated his life. Henceforth his spare time, after office hours was spent in gospel work in the city. When Moody and Sankey came to Glasgow in the following year, he entered with enthusiasm into the campaign. He was caught in the wave of the 1874 revival, which so profoundly moved the community and left effects which are felt and seen to this day. His voice was often heard at the open-air services, which were so numerous at that period, and in many other ways he labored with all the zeal of a young convert who gloried in the opportunity. At this time he met one with whom he formed an intimate and lifelong friendship, Pastor D.J. Findlay. Mr. Findlay was then carrying on work in the St. George's Tent Mission, which has now for more than half a century had a settled home in the Tabernacle, that great center of evangelical life in Glasgow, whose influence extends to the ends of the earth. Dr. Main and Mr. Findlay, both of them, then young men, preached the gospel together at street corners, at kitchen meetings, in canvas tents, and in halls in Glasgow, wherever there was opportunity, through all the intervening years, when even while seas divided them, the close intimacy of their friendship and fellowship has been maintained unbroken to the enrichment of the life and work of both. In the glow of his newfound zeal for the winning of souls, the mind of David Main reverted to one of the heroes of his childhood, David Livingstone, and he became fired with the idea that he too might be able to carry the gospel to the heathen. And let's not call people heathen, pagan, infidel, Gentile just because they're of a different religion even. His activities in evangelical work brought him into association with many interesting personalities from far and near, and he was specially attracted and impressed by Dr. Donald Morrison, who had been for many years a medical missionary in India. In his contact with Dr. Morrison, he heard from personal experience of the needs of those who were still in outer darkness. Well, the Bible talks about outer darkness, where there was the wailing and gnashing of teeth, of the superstitions which held them in bondage, of the cruel and often loathsome diseases from which they seemed to have no deliverance. The work of a medical missionary made an ever-growing appeal to his imagination and consecrated enthusiasm. There was something in it that fascinated one who was eager to be doing something practical while never losing sight of the ultimate aim. He saw how it might be possible by healing the bodies of the heathen. Yeah, pagan and heathen were originally just things about material culture. Because pagan meant that the land was divided into work plots. So land wasn't just possession. You had to work the land. Or at least someone around did. To win an opening for speaking to them about their souls, more and more he came under the sway of what was truly a divine impulse, until he finally made up his mind to give up his business career and devote his life to the work of a medical missionary. In the decision once reached, he set himself forthwith to the task of preparation. While still continuing his office duties, he attended morning and evening classes with private tutors for physics, Latin, French, etc., and attended lectures on evangelistic theology in the Free Church College. By assiduous application to his studies, while never abating his activity in evangelistic and open-air work, he was able to pass the medical preliminary examination of Glasgow University, and in 1877 he joined the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society for his special training. During the 4 years of his course in Edinburgh, he had further opportunities in a fresh field of exercising his evangelical activity. In the slums of the Scottish capital, he found the need as great as in the worst districts of Glasgow, with which he had been familiar, but the students were not afraid to penetrate even the most forbidding localities. They went out and in among the people, rendering much needed service while acquiring for themselves a practical experience of the utmost value for their future work. In connection with the evening services and Magdalene Chapel, the students organized open-air meetings in the Cowgate and also visited some of the common lodging houses in the attempt to gather a congregation. The story was still told of one memorable evening when, in answer to the invitation to come to a service, a male lodger said, "Me go to service. You'd have to carry me there." "All right," said David Main, who was one of the party of students, and without more ado, he took the man on his back and carried him down the 2 stairs and across the Cowgate to the chapel, followed by a small crowd who were also drawn to attend the service. The incident, which made so definite an impression at the time, was but characteristic of other unconventional things this student was to do in the same cause in after years in a far-off land. He showed thus early that he was not to be bound by precedent, but was ready to do and dare, often in the most unexpected ways. In 1881, David Main secured his medical degree, and in that year also he found his life partner in Miss Florence Nightingale Smith. Never surely has there been a happier or more blessed union. Miss Smith had been, like her future husband, a worker in the slums of Edinburgh, and was associated with the Free Breakfast Mission and the Cowgate Medical Mission. Her experience there proved of considerable value to her abroad, while she also developed remarkable qualities of resourcefulness, ability, and endurance in her service in the wards, her ministrations to the native patients, and the influence of her personality. She came to be, in her own way, a worthy successor to the great Lady of the Lamp, whose name she bore. Through his associations with Dr. Morrison, the thoughts of Dr. Main had turned instinctively to India, and it became the dream of his life to devote himself to the work in that country. Eventually, he volunteered for service in the Indian mission field. The claims of China were, however, so urgently pressed upon him that he was prevailed upon to change his plan and accept an appointment to the Mid-China mission of the Church Missionary Society. Here, in view of all that has happened since then, there can now be seen the divine intervention. His will was wisely overruled by a higher, and he was set to his God-given task. The marriage of Dr. and Miss Main took place in Edinburgh, and they sailed in September 1881 for China, their destination being Hangzhou. The voyage took longer in those days, and it was November before they arrived in Shanghai. Their first experience of the new country was somewhat disconcerting, if not even discouraging. They were strangers in a strange land, and no one had to come to meet them. There was no friendly greeting, nor was there anyone to help them over the initial difficulties with foreign customs and an unknown language. By the aid of a stranger, they secured their luggage and made their way to one of the hotels. There remained for a time until the chaplain of Shanghai Cathedral, the Reverend W.L. Groves, learning of their presence, invited them to be guests in his house until their journey to Hangzhou could be resumed. It was a welcome change from hotel life to the congenial society of a Christian home, and the young couple were grateful for such hospitality. A rough passage was experienced on the next stage of the journey from Shanghai to Ningpo, but they were happy to be met there by a Hangzhou missionary and his bride on their honeymoon, who took them to share the hospitality of the mission house. Then the one young couple escorted the other as far as Shaoying, where Dr. and Mrs. Main met. the late Bishop Moule, who accompanied them on the last stage to Hangzhou. Their first experience of the city, which was to be their home for so many years, was in striking contrast to that in Shanghai. A warm welcome was extended to them by the Reverend Dr. Arthur Elwin and Miss Elwin, with whom they stayed until their own house was ready. It was when a winter day was drawing to a close that Dr. and Miss Main were received by their fellow missionaries in Hangzhou, and they soon forgot the cold and privation and numerous discomforts of their long journey as they gathered round the cheerful fire. Yet the surroundings at first were strangely unfamiliar. The large rooms, designated in view of the great heat of the intensely hot summers, seemed cold to the newcomers, who indeed were comfortable only when they were close to the fire. The attendants also were a new study. The Chinese men servants, in their long blue coats and their warm padded cotton wool undercoats, looked fat and important, while the shaved head, bland smile, and dignified manner at their work seemed almost awe-inspiring to those unacquainted with their ways. Next morning, Dr. Main was eager to see something of the city which was to be his home and the scene of his work, and soon after breakfast Mr. Elwin was ready to show him around. Hangzhou was known to the natives as Heaven Below, while Dr. Main's Chinese name was Dr. Apricot, hence the title of Dr. Apricot of Heaven Below, by which he became so widely known. The city is one of great importance and antiquity. Greatly revered by the Chinese, it is the capital of Zhejiang, the smallest of China's 18 provinces, and under the Sung dynasty it was the capital of China. The Chinese held it to be one of the two most beautiful cities in the world. Marco Polo, a great Venetian traveler, declared that the streets of Hangzhou and its shops were unrivaled by the greatest cities of Europe. The first mention of Hangzhou is in 2198 BCE, and it was then a noted city, but its highest fame was probably in the 10th and 15th centuries. One enthusiastic visitor has placed on record that it hath more than 12,000 bridges. It is the greatest, noblest of cities, the finest for merchandise the whole world containeth. Among many industries, silk manufacture was always one of the most important, with thousands of hand looms weaving both day and night. Cotton spinning also gave employment to many of the people, and numerous products were prepared for export. As a seaport, Hangzhou came to be of increasing importance because of its situation at the head of the Yentang River. The city suffered very severely in the Taiping Rebellion and was taken by the rebels in 1862. Thousands of dwelling houses and many temples were burned down, and when Dr. Main arrived in 1881, these had not been rebuilt, but if in some districts there were scenes of devastation, the business part of the city was as thronged as and as active as ever. As Dr. Main made his first tour in the company of his guide, he learned many interesting historical facts about Hangzhou and gained a vivid conception of the importance of the place. He was soon, however, to learn something of other and less pleasing aspects. The streets were a revelation to him, not only with their seething crowds, but also because of the revolting smells and sights. In the jostling throng, it was almost impossible to make any progress. Vendors of all kinds and wares were shouting to the limit of their lung power. Children were screaming, and coolies were crying to the crowds to make way for them. And the sedan chairs in which they were carrying those who could afford that means of transport, men with yokes fitted to their shoulders, were carrying sewage from dwelling houses, and sewage pits were uncovered through the streets. Open cesspools stood at the corners. Unsightly lepers and maimed beggars in all states of decay rubbed shoulders with the throng. The smells encountered were beyond description. I think we kind of described the sort of smells that the senior missionary glanced occasionally at his young companion to see what were the first effects upon him as they passed through the worst quarters. He expected to find a look of disgust. What I did see, he remarked, was a merry twinkle in Dr. Main's bright eyes, a distinctly shut mouth, as if no word could he speak until his lungs were filled again with something purer than that which they were then breathing, for he knew that to breathe through the nose under such circumstances was the only thing to do. As for the young doctor himself, he was saying to himself, and this is the city of heaven below, how vastly below. Then his ready sense of humor came to his aid as he saw diseased people mixing freely in the crowds with their open sores exposed to the cold and dust and microbes. He recalled the story of the Dublin Jarvey, who, when asked to explain why patients were sent to live on the banks of the Liffey, where the odors were so dreadful that people in good health could hardly endure them, said, "Ah, sure the smells is that bad. They kill all the germs." Well, we know that's not true, but the streets had also attractive features of interest. A barber was shaving a customer in the doorway of his shop, while alongside was a lamp maker beating his iron. Lead or tin on the counter. Umbrella makers were greasing their papers, cutting patterns, and gluing them on bamboo frames in all view of the passers-by. The numerous silk shops were a constant temptation to the newcomer to secure some of the lovely colored materials for friends in the homeland. The tobacco stores, the flower merchant with his many-colored cakes, and especially to a doctor, the medicine stores with their strange native remedies, were all of interest. So much for the city, its streets and its people, but what of its religion? China was in the grip of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Some families combined the three religions, and in almost every instance, ancestral worship was practiced. For centuries, the people had been bound in superstition and idolatry. Countless numbers were slaves to the opium habit, and over the land there brooded the darkness of those who had not yet come to rejoice in the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Well, plenty of people are bright and rejoicing in their own faith. It was a new and strange environment in which the young doctor found himself, but he was not dismayed. His anxiety was to be able as soon as possible to talk to the natives in their own tongue. "When can I begin to learn Chinese?" he asked before the close of his first day. And when he received the answer, "Tomorrow," he was greatly delighted. Writing many years afterwards, Miss Main revealed the fact that instead of the leisure with which missionaries can now acquire the language, the doctor had just 50 hours of quiet for language study before his work actually began. At times, the difficulties and peculiarities of this strange foreign tongue were such that the hearts of the new missionaries sank within them. Then the doctor would save the situation with some of his jokes, and after a hearty laugh, the lessons would be happily resumed. One day, his mistake in the tone of a word caused some merriment at his expense, but he enjoyed the fun as much as anyone. Then he suddenly asked, "Why do 4 P's in succession lead to a 5th?" No one had an answer ready, so he gave it himself. By perpetual prayer and patient perseverance, proficiency is attained even in the Chinese language. That was the spirit in which he attacked and overcame his initial difficulties, and he was soon learning Chinese from every man and woman he met, and no quicker way could be found for colloquial speech than by mixing with the natives. It was soon recognized that a new type of missionary had arrived on the scene. There was about him so much of genial humanity, and he had such a sense of the humor and joy of things that he carried a bright and happy influence wherever he went. He saw that something needed to be done to enliven even the missionaries, and he confided the idea to his wife. "I was told today," she replied, "that China is honeycombed with secret societies, and you are here only 24 hours and have already started a secret society of your own." "Yes," said the doctor, "we must have a Keep Smiling Society and get them all to join." Of the effect of the senior missionary spoke enthusiastically. "When the Maines came," he declared, "we realized a new spirit had entered the mission field. The doctor could be as serious as the gravest of us when need arose, yet with a smile and a joke, he could work harder than the hardest of us. Mission life was never again the monotonous strain it had hitherto been." Dr. Maine's first walk in Hangzhou took him to the opium refuge. He found a small house with 4 rooms and 16 beds where work had been intermittently carried on for a number of years when there was any staff available. It had been unused for some time and was not in the best condition. Indeed, the whole appearance was sufficient to damp the enthusiasm of a young doctor who had given up what might have been a lucrative career at home. But in the silence of his own heart he reconstructed himself to the service he had undertaken, saying nothing to his companion either of his first impressions or of his aspirations in the way of reconstruction, which he saw at once were urgently necessary. He had sufficient caution and discernment to realize that it was better first to become familiar with the whole situation. It was, however, necessary for the refuge to be repaired and thoroughly cleaned before being reopened for a few opium patients and some serious general cases not suitable for outside treatment. In the meantime, Dr. and Miss Maine had settled in the doctor's house. The dispensary was opened only twice a week, but patients flocked to it from all quarters. As many as 200 or 250 would crowd around the gate before the opening hour. Miss Maine and a native helper attended to the dressings and, under the doctor's supervision, made up prescriptions and generally carried out his orders. A catechist preached hour after hour to the patients, who were content to wait long enough if only they could succeed at last in seeing the doctor. It was arduous work under difficult conditions, physically wearing and often depressing, yet the day's work had sometimes a humorous experience to brighten it. Here is one such. Instead of sedan chairs, some of the missionaries preferred to ride horses, and they proposed to give the young doctor some riding lessons. By providing him with the most frisky of the 3 ponies, they expected some fun. The doctor made no remark, but took all their instructions quietly and meekly as they prepared for the first canter on the deserted racecourse. He was told to keep firm hold and learn to keep his seat, while his 2 instructors would trot around to see how he stood the test. This did not see the twinkle in his eye, but he had been accustomed to riding bareback ponies all his life. The trotting began, but the doctor soon let his pony go, throwing the reins loose, and from some hundreds of yards ahead, waving a farewell to the missionaries as he went off full speed right round the course. He was, at the end, waiting for the slower and less experienced riders who had learned that it was not easy to score at the expense of the latest recruit to their ranks. When making the most of the accommodation and appliances available, Dr. Main all the time was working, begging and praying for a larger hospital, the need for which he felt to be simply appalling. One day, after he had dealt with some 250 cases and feeling unusually fatigued, he returned to find the mail from home had arrived. He had time to go through only part of the letters. When he had to hurry off to see some European and American patients, when he got back, more than 2 hours later, he had only been a short time in the mission house when several calls reached him, and he had to hurry off again without seeing any more of his letters. Miss Main was also interrupted time and again, and the letters still remained unopened. It was late that night before the doctor and his wife were at last able to deal with the correspondence. Then a pleasant surprise came to them. Out of one of the first letters, there dropped a check for £1,700 towards the proposed new hospital. In others, there were promises of subscriptions and many other encouragements. All this acted like a tonic on the tired doctor. On his way to bed, he had a look at the plans which he had ready in his private drawer, and he retired after midnight to dream of the prospects of extension and expansion of the work which now seemed within reach. The Hospital of Universal Benevolence. Well, they didn't just help them, you have to listen to the preaching or you get nothing. Some countries don't allow that stuff. You must attend church service, you must, or we won't give you anything. It's like, even forcing them to claim Christianity or they're not going to get help, In 1883, of the Common Era, there took place the laying of the foundation stone of the Hospital of Universal Benevolence. It was, in every sense of the term, Dr. Main's idea. He was architect, general overseer, and master of works, and all these in addition to his other duties. Along with his missionary activities, he had become general practitioner in the city to the American and other missionaries, while his practice in the hospital and among the more wealthy Chinese had so greatly extended as to materially help the funds for this extension scheme. The ceremony of laying the foundation stone was attended in state by high official Chinese, city merchants, European residents, English and American missionaries, natives and native Christians, and a large number of grateful heathen who had experienced the benefits of the hospital and dispensary. Now, if people are living in huts and working around fires and stuff, maybe they don't have those things. But it's not because of their religion. In the following spring, May 1884, the hospital was opened in the presence of a still larger and more representative gathering. It was a day of praise and thanksgiving, for the hospital itself was an answer to prayer. But the Chinese had also great rejoicings in their own way. Fireworks, the great outlet in China for joy and gladness, were set off in the gardens. The more the Chinese rejoice, the longer and louder are the crackers, and on this occasion of so great rejoicing, they were very long and loud indeed. Amid all the demonstrations, the natives, rich and poor, made offerings of large lacquer boards bearing in Chinese characters grateful testimonies from recovered patients, and these were presented to the doctor and hung over the doorways on the veranda of the new hospital. Altogether, it was a great occasion, and it signalized the opening of a new era in the work of the mission. The Hospital of Universal Benevolence was destined to fill a place of increasing importance, usefulness, and influence as time went on, and to be, in a sense, the center of a whole network of institutions and agencies. It provided at once 100 beds, and all of these were speedily filled with patients, some of the wards being allowed to women. The old hospital, after alterations and additions, which included new kitchens and offices, was reopened for opium patients. An opium victim saved. Yeah, intoxicants should be for survival only, not, The opium curse had made slaves of countless numbers of the people, and it was one of the greatest obstacles to the mission cause. Its degrading effects were only too visible to all who came in contact with its victims. One interesting patient received into the opium refuge was Lewa Ta Swen, who seemed in the last stage of misery. Dr. Main tried every means of arousing and interesting him. He spoke to him of other lands and other peoples in the hopes of distracting his attention from his sufferings. Well, suffering's not the same as hardship, but definitely you would usually find suffering too in that situation. And he read the story of Christ's life to him and explained it. At last, the man sat up and began to listen and ask questions. Praying for strength and guidance, the doctor told him of a God who loved him and would help him. He prayed with him and eventually had the joy of leading him to find deliverance and peace. Le Roi Taswen proved to be more educated than most of his fellows, and he was soon telling the other patients of his experience and seeking to lead them in the way of life. On his complete recovery, he was sent to Trinity College to complete his education. In course of time, he became a catechist and was used in doing a wonderful work. He was instrumental in winning many for Christ, including his wife and children, one of his sons eventually becoming a medical student in Dr. Main's hospital. This case, typical of others, was the kind of thing which encouraged those who were laboring so earnestly, alike in spiritual as well as material things. When quite a young man, Dr. Main had formed the habit of early rising, and it was by keeping up this practice in China that he was able, day after day, for so many years, to carry on such far-reaching activities. And it was in keeping with his own temperament that he soon found he could do more himself and get more out of other people by smiles than by frowns. His advice to young recruits who joined the mission was always get at it early, work at it steadily, take healthy exercise, and keep smiling. And his words had all the more weight because it was found he practiced what he preached. It was well that he had a sense of humor as well as the utmost tact and patience for, particularly in the early days before there was adequate nursing assistance. There were many trying and curious incidents in the hospital experiences. After an operation, the patient, with the help of his neighbor in the next bed, had undone his bandages to see how the wound looked. Another had eaten his poultice. A patient, not used to splints, thought he could sleep better without them, and had taken them off. These and similar instances made the work of the doctor, his assistant, and Miss Main doubly difficult. It often meant, after a tiring day, having to do some hours' work all over again, an ordeal which required real Christian patience, but incidents such as these emphasized the need for the additional helpers for whom the doctor longed and prayed. In all the medical work of the hospital, the spiritual aim was steadily kept in view. Reviewing the work of 1885, Dr. Main wrote, "We endeavor to meet the needs of the souls as well as the bodies of the patients. In the outpatients' waiting room, the gospel is preached. Before the dispensary doors are opened, the inpatients are taught in the wards if unable to get to the preaching hall, which is attended morning and evening by all on the premises. If able to be out of bed, this service is much appreciated. We sing hymns, read the Bible, have an explanation, and close with prayer before the work of the doctor begins in the hospital." On trek. In his work at distant outstations where Dr. Main had regular dispensary days, he usually took a catechist with him who could teach the patients while he was otherwise engaged. On one such journey to a village some 20 miles distant, he had a somewhat alarming experience. After a long ride on horseback, he proceeded to cross a river by boat. It was a tidal river, and the tide was getting so low that the boatman said he would carry the doctor to dry land. Very soon, however, the doctor, feeling he was too great a burden, insisted on getting down to walk. He shortly found himself in quicksands. He was soon up to his knees, then he was sucked in to his hips, and found the wet sand closing round his waist. And when he got buried up to his armpits, nothing but death seemed before him. As he prayed for deliverance, the boatman had been shouting his loudest for help. As the two men in a boat appeared, he cried, "Save the life of the foreign doctor." In their boat, they had a number of planks, which were placed on the wet sand, and lying carefully lengthwise to disperse their weight, they made their way towards the doctor. With long and vigorous pulling, the two men at last got him out, and when he had came to a safer place, he walked up to his neck in water to free himself and his clothes from the sand. Having expressed his gratitude to his rescuers, he continued his walk in the sun for some miles and arrived at the dispensary dry and fully recovered. True to his own motto, he was able to keep smiling, but it was also with a grateful heart for his deliverance that he took up the dispensary duties awaiting him. Cases of leprosy proved for a time a serious problem because of the difficulty of dealing with them at the hospital, but Dr. Main got in touch with the mission to lepers in Edinburgh, and through their instrumentality, he was able to open a leper refuge outside, but within easy reach of the hospital itself. This was opened in 1889, and for its support, along with that of the Home for the Lepers Children, superintended by Miss Main, the mission to lepers has continued to be responsible. The time was now approaching for the first furlough, and in 1890, Dr. and Miss Main, after 9 years of continuous service, left for the homeland. On their way, they attended to the Shanghai Conference, which delegates from all parts of China and from all denominations at work in that country meet to confer on the missionary work and problems. After their arrival in England, a short period of rest was obtained among their friends in Scotland, and then Dr. Main was off on deputation work in all parts of the kingdom. In this he was always very happy and successful in the highest sense. His engaging personality made friends for him wherever he went, and he had a wonderful story to tell of work already accomplished, and of fields white unto the harvest. It was not in public meetings alone that his influence was felt. On railway journeys, and wherever he came in contact with his fellow men and women, he was able to interest them in the great work in Hangzhou. One lady was heard telling her friends, "I've heard Dr. Main whenever I could, ever since 1890, and have prayed for his work every week for 25 years. It was the doctor's constant plea as he addressed meetings all over England and Scotland. Remember us in your prayers. And there can be no doubt that it was the response thus elicited that told so markedly on his future work in the foreign field. Returned from furlough. It was just before Christmas when the doctor and his wife, and their 2 little boys arrived back in Hangzhou, and they had something like a royal welcome from crowds of European and Chinese friends. How great a contrast to their quiet and uneventful reception 10 years before. But in the interval, he had come to be known and trusted by all classes, high officials, and wealthy patients, as well as the rank and file, as a skillful medical man, and also as a friend to whom they could go for help and advice in temporal and spiritual difficulties of all kinds. The Chinese had learned that the doctor was a very much businessman with leisure amid all his duties to deal with cases of distress, but with no time to fritter away on non-essentials. Idleness in his eyes was a crime not to be endured. Punctuality was a rule never to be broken, and while he dealt with many things that were subsidiary and helpful, he always kept first things first. One of the earliest developments during the second term of service was the opening in 1894 of the new women's hospital with 100 beds. Then there was the convalescent home for tuberculosis, and later a leper home for women. The increasing number on the nursing staff rendered it imperative in course of time to erect a nurse's home, and there were also the students for whom provision had to be made. From the outset of his work in Hangzhou, Dr. Main realized that the quickest as well as the best way of furthering the work was to train and equip native young men and send them forth for wider service. He began his medical school with a few likely youths, winning them for Christ, teaching them medicine and surgery, and then sending them forth to heal and help their fellows and become missionaries of the cross to their own people. Accommodation had to be provided for these students during their 5 years course, and a building for this purpose was added to the others. And thus did the mission colony grow as the years went on, and in the center of it all was the chapel. With the steadily increasing staff and the growing congregations, the original chapel had become too small, and in answer to many prayers, another and a larger took its place. In it, many witnessed a good confession of faith, and Chinese and Europeans knelt together as one family, united in the worship and service of Christ. War difficulties. When Dr. Main was at home on furlough in 1900, the Boxer riots occurred, and the future of the Hangzhou mission seemed for a time to be at stake. Even the lives of the missionaries and the doctors on duty were in peril. The Empress sent a telegram to the 4 provincial officials to kill all the Hangzhou missionaries and destroy their property. Out of the 4, so commanded, only one was found willing to obey the Empress, and the significant fact was that all the 3 who refused were friends of Dr. Main, especially the Manchu general of the forces, who for many years had been his staunch ally. Although Dr. and Mrs. Main were at the time in Scotland, it was therefore through their influence and the memory of their continual kindness and helpfulness to the Chinese that their fellow missionaries, their hospitals, and other property were spared amid all the massacre. No wonder that when Dr. Main returned at the close of 1900, he was compelled to leave Miss Main behind at Shanghai. He was met by crowds who escorted him to his home with flags and banners waving, rockets firing, and other demonstrations of joyous welcome. During his third period of service, the work still continued to make progress. More new buildings were added, and in other ways, there were developments and extensions. It was gratifying to find how old suspicions and doubts of the foreigner and his methods and aims had been dispelled. The humanitarian work of the hospital and its accessories, and the genial, helpful friendliness of Dr. Main had told on the general attitude of the Chinese, and not least on the officials and others in places of influence. In 1910, after a further long and strenuous term, Dr. Main was able to enjoy another furlough. But, as on all his other visits to the homeland, his time was very largely occupied in visitation work on behalf of the mission. He had still all his unique power of awakening interest and enthusiasm. One hearer who had enjoyed his bright and humorous sallies remarked, "If Maine had a pound note for every laugh he has given a man, and every good story he has told, there would be a large balance on the right side of the Hangzhou Hospital account." Shortly after he returned to the mission, civil war had broken out in China, but hospital work went on as usual in 1911. Writing in the midst of his activities at this period, Dr. Main said, "I have many things to encourage me, a good wife, faithful colleagues, willing assistants, splendid health, good digestion, and plenty to digest. All my senses, including a strong sense of humor, happy temperament, and able, under most circumstances, to keep smiling. Letters every week from dear friends at home, full of cheer and often with little slips of paper with a signature at the bottom, which are most welcome, and many tokens from the Chinese of interest and practical sympathy. Work progressing all round, but things were for a time in an unsettled state. New revolutionaries had appeared and several were executed, while 3 bombs were discovered in a house only a few yards from the mission. In the midst of it all, Dr. Main was summoned to see the governor. His diagnosis of smallpox disagreed with that of several native doctors who had been called in before he was consulted, but it was found to be correct. This made a great impression on the governor, who, as a mark of his gratitude, sent Dr. Main a gift of several pictures and a valuable small vase. The effect of some of his operations on the natives astonished the people beyond all bounds. There were many cases of cataract, and when the patients, after the operation, found that they were able to see, they could not contain themselves for joy. The news spread abroad. The foreign doctor can make the blind to see. It was the same after he had treated cases of deafness resulting from measles, scarlet fever, or caused by adenoids or other troubles. Again, reports circled from the city. The foreign doctor can make the deaf to hear, and all the additional influence thus gained by the doctor was turned to good account as he sought to win the people for his master. The years of the great European War, which broke out in 1914, made a heavy drain on the Hangzhou mission. So many of the hospital staff had left to join the forces that Dr. and Miss Main were each doing the work of 2 or 3 people. In addition, they had family anxieties, with one son seriously ill at home and the other at the front. Even when Armistice Day brought a cessation of fighting in the West, It was but the beginning of trouble in the Eastern Hemisphere, and China was being engulfed in the unrest which was to continue for so long. But through it all, Dr. Main continued his beneficent work, and with many signs and wonders following for his encouragement. Keep smiling. One thing which greatly cheered him was the realization after 42 years of his dream for the medical college, adequate for the needs of his work in the mission. This was made possible largely by a donation of £10,000 given to Dr. Main by Lord Maclay in memory of his son, Ebenezer, who had dedicated his life to the work of a medical missionary but died from wounds when serving in the war as a lieutenant in the 1st Scots Guards. At the opening ceremony, it was remarked that this most beautiful structure represents years of patient labor and unwavering faith. Dr. Main, as president, was accompanied by the faculty in academic caps and gowns, and but for the exigencies of civil war, there would have been present H.M. Minister to China, the British Consul, and Bishop Maloney. Among the many speeches, there was a delightful testimony by a native pastor who had told the audience that 40 years ago, Dr. Main had saved his life by an operation. Using a Chinese expression, he declared that the doctor had helped him to leak out of his coffin and then sealed the hole. A happy picture has been given by a fellow missionary of the friendly relations Dr. Main had then established with the Chinese and of the unique place he had made for himself in Hangzhou. It was necessary, he said, in the long distances Dr. Main had to travel on his medical duties, for him to use sturdy Mongolian ponies, who, according to custom, when being rapidly ridden through the narrow streets and roads, wore a score of bells fastened to their collars. Immediately the bells were heard. Way was made in the throng, and the cry went out, "Dr. Main, Dr. Main, Dr. Main." Everyone smiled and nodded to him as he passed through their midst. Seeing here and there an old patient, he would prod them lightly on the shoulder, calling, "Keep smiling," while they laughed heartily back at him, so proud of being singled out of the throng as a friend of the great foreign doctor. Another has told of how delightful it was to see him with children. They drew out a charming side of his character. His manner with the old was impressive and touching. He would alight from his pony on seeing some aged man or woman, and to the delight of the person himself or herself, and not less to the crowd of spectators, he would bow profoundly and reverently before them, addressing them most kindly. This was always a real joy and delight to those who saw it, whether foreigners or natives. A very superior man, the great foreign doctor, the natives would remark. He reads our classics, he knows well our properties, he has much courtesy, and his manners are very excellent. It was also a striking commentary on the place Dr. Main made for himself that the highest officials would ask his advice at any critical time about engineering and road making and tree planting, as well as about deeper and more vital matters. By his unfailing tact and the charm of his personality, he had won their confidence in a very remarkable degree. It was difficult to believe, after so many years of peace and goodwill among the Chinese in Hangzhou, where so much had been done to the appreciation both of the officials and the people, that even for a time the tide would turn and there would be unrest and even opposition. There were 4 years of trying experiences. Dr. and Miss Main had a narrow escape during the Japanese earthquake of 1923, and for days they seemed to be looking death in the face. The Civil War of 1924, the anti-British boycott of 1925, and the beginning of the insidious Red influence in 1926 all tested the patience and faith of the mission staff. Dr. Main had many interviews and consultations with the public officials and an anxious time generally, but through all the period of stress and strain, even when every effort seemed to be made to wreck the mission, he kept calm and collected with that radiant faith and ready adaptability to every emergency, which helped to rally the members of his staff and infect them with something of his own spirit. We are not standing still and complaining, he said, because we feel there are better things on ahead, and we mean to make the effort towards them and keep smiling. A cheery disposition is like air in a tire. There does not seem to be much of it, but it makes the going easier and happier for everybody. The rougher the road, the more you need it, and the help of God. As time passed, the tumult and excitement passed away, and matters once more resumed to their normal state. In the beginning of 1926, it was realized that Dr. Main was approaching the retiring age and that he would have to take farewell of the Hangzhou Hospital and the other departments of his loved work at the end of the year. He occupied his remaining time in seeing that the many-sided structure he had reared was placed on a sound basis so that the mission might still go on in all its various branches, and while he and Miss Main were making their final arrangements and packing up for home, extensive preparations were on foot for a fitting farewell, which would in some measure mark the great importance and significance of his life work in Hangzhou. At the final graduation in the medical school, before his departure, reference was made to the work of Dr. Main as founder and first president of the college. There were many other farewell functions and the special feasts, the Chinese having a special farewell meeting of their own, while numerous parting gifts were presented. A tremendous crowd, the like of which had never been seen before, gathered in the streets and in the railway station on the day of their departure. Throughout Friday morning, December 3rd, 1926, there was an apparently unending stream of callers to say goodbye personally. The front garden of the hospital was decorated with the flags of all nations, while the five-colored flag and the Union Jack fluttered in the breeze outside the hospital entrance as Dr. and Miss Main left the hospital to catch the 2 o'clock train for Shanghai. Large numbers of the staff stood with bared heads, their hearts too full for words. The car was driven slowly to the station, preceded by banners and a brass band, and followed by a crowd of people on foot. Inside the station, the platforms were packed with representatives of the local officials, most of the Hangzhou missionaries, members of the hospital staff, heads of firms, the medical and pharmacy students, and innumerable outside friends. A pretty instant was the presentation of bouquets by the children of the local American school, while flowers were waved by pupils of St. Faith's School, led by the principal. A special car had been attached to the rear of the train, and from its windows the doctor and his wife took their farewells, while the assembled crowd joined in singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" as the train steamed out of the station, while the band still continued playing. Dr. Main stood in the doorway of the car, and while his heart was full to overflowing, it could be seen that he was still exemplifying his old motto, "Keep smiling." An enduring monument. Dr. Main entered Hangzhou young and unknown. He left it one of the best-known men in the community, and crowned with honors and distinctions, the Chinese government made him Mandarin of the 5th rank in 1895. This was followed by the 4th decoration of the Excellent Corps, after which he received the 3rd and 2nd, and latterly there was added the 2nd Order with Great Sash. He had permission from King George to wear the honors which had been bestowed upon him. But his greatest and most lasting distinction was in the mission station which he left behind him. When he arrived at Hangzhou in 1881, he found a small house with 4 rooms having 16 beds. When he retired in 1926 after 45 years' service, he left a men's hospital, women's hospital, outpatients department, lock hospital, maternity hospital, children's home, medical training college, pharmacy training college, nurse home for foreigners, nursing home for foreigners, nursing training school, men's, nursing training school, women's, radiopathic and electrotherapeutic department, works department, evangelistic department, leper hospital for men, leper hospital for women, isolation hospital for men, isolation hospital for women, consumptive hospital, fresh air home for men, fresh air home for women, Dr. Main's home of rest for workers, Miss Main's home of rest for women workers, pastor's home of rest, convalescent home for high-class Chinese gentlemen, convalescent sanatorium for Chinese ladies, home for incurables, almshouse, ragged school, 2 rooms for the insane, a commemorative tablet erected in the pavilion in front of the men's hospital will speak to future generations of the work of Dr. Main in Hangzhou, but it can always be said of him to anyone in that city, as it was said of Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral. If you want to see his monument, look around. The many buildings in connection with the Hangzhou Hospital and Mission will be his monument for many years to come. But he left a still more enduring monument in the hearts and lives of the Chinese. His greatest work as a medical man in the hospitals and in private can never be forgotten, and all that work, so valuable, so helpful, and healing in itself, was but part of a greater and more lasting work. As he once put it, there is no pulpit so influential as a hospital ward, and no pew where the hearer is so receptive as a hospital bed. In the past, a medical mission was looked upon as a means to an end, a bell to bring people to church. Now it is an integral part of the church's mission, fulfilling its work by winning men to Christ by the power of the gospel. Dr. Main was a great missionary as well as a great doctor. He could preach to old and young with all the natural fervor of an evangelist who had never lost his grip on the essentials of the evangelical faith or the glow of his early consecration. But he also preached every day by his life as he went out and in among the people, healing, helping, and cheering all sorts and conditions of men and women. And one of the secrets of his success and wide-lasting influence was to be found in the fact that, through all the varying experiences of his many years in the foreign field, he was able to remain true to his own motto, keep smiling. No man of his day and generation did more to show how the life of a missionary, instead of being dull and prosaic, would be full of brightness and romance. Among the life stories of the statesmen and empire builders, soldiers and heroes who have written their names on the roll of fame, the life story of this hero of the cross and the name of Dr. Duncan Main of Hangzhou are worthy of a place of their own. His career is fitted to inspire the youth of today with the highest ambitions in the noblest service, open to men, following the footsteps of him who went about healing the sick, cleansing the lepers, opening the eyes of the blind, telling the people of the love of God. Since his return from China in 1927, Dr. Main has been residing in Edinburgh, but even in retirement, his influence is still felt. The work he initiated and inspired is carried on by young men and women whom he trained in medicine, nursing, and pharmacy, and who caught something of his spirit. Something of his graduates are filling positions of honor and distinction in the government and witnessing a good confession for the master whom he taught them to love and serve. When he was in China himself, Dr. Main's influence permeated its public and private life by means of his own personality. Even now, when he is living in retirement in Scotland, his influence is still a pervasive force by means of those who came under the sway of his teaching and example. It was with sure insight and Christian vision that he set himself throughout his long sojourn in China to raise up such a band of native young men and women to continue and still further extend the work. But Dr. Main also still keeps in close touch with all that is going on in Hangzhou, and by means of his influence at home and his personal support and prayers, he continues to be a source of strength to the mission, which always lies so close to his heart. As he surveys his own life work from the calm of an eventide, which is as full of brightness as his long working day, it is with the humble, grateful heart of one who is constrained to say, "It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And we have the back page bit. And do they use the same picture for the whole series? Because some of that stuff there just doesn't make sense with what we're talking about.